So welcome to the session on the third aggregate, which is sanya in Pali, usually translated as perception, sometimes recognition, discernment. It's a kind of, it's what leads to pleasant, unpleasant, neutral, and I'll talk a bit about how that comes about. So I'm just going to read something I wrote down before I started developing this talk regarding the whole five aggregates. The five aggregates that constitute what we call an individual or personality are themselves conditioned phenomenon in a state of continuous flux, arising and ceasing from moment to moment, with no persisting or permanent nature in them. One has no ownership or control over them, and when one identifies with them as I or me, it can only lead to suffering due to their very transient nature. So that kind of sums up what we're exploring here with these five aggregates, is we're seeing that there's no ownership or control over them. They're constantly arising and passing away. They're in constant flux. And that's really what the Buddha is inviting us to see for ourselves when we look at each of these five aggregates. And so the first one we looked at material form or rupa or body, to see that it's constantly changing. We don't actually control what goes on in the body. If we did, we would never get ill, for example. So then we went to Vedna, that the arising of pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral. We explored that to see how it just happens. It just arises. You don't control whether something arises as pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. And those first two, there are also two of the four foundations of mindfulness, which is good to know, because the Buddha also invited us to really use those as meditation objects to establish mindfulness. So you can use the body and you can use feeling tone, as foundations for establishing mindfulness. Perception isn't one of the foundations, which is interesting. Whenever I teach sort of Vedna or feeling tone, I always kind of lump in perception with it, because they're so intimately connected, and you'll see that as we talk about them. So when I sort of practiced over the week with them, I kind of saw different aspects of perception, and the usual one that if you read stuff on the internet or listen to Dharma talks, they'll refer to it as that which recognizes and labels an object. Right? It perceives what the object is. Kind of makes sense of the world, gives it some meaning. So when you hear a chirping sound, I don't know if you can hear that outside my window here. Perception recognizes it and gives it and puts the label on it, bird. And if you're perhaps a birder, it might even put a more specific label as, what type of bird, cardinal, for example. And so it's based on all your past memories and your knowledge of things you've come in contact with. So when you come in contact with something new that you've never seen or heard, your mind has to try to make sense of it, give it some meaning, categorize it, compare it with what's known from your experience, and then see if it can actually give it a label, right? So that next time you see it, you'll know what it is, right? If you didn't have perception, you just kind of wander around lost. You wouldn't know what anything is. You wouldn't recognize anything. I mean, it really does. It's the basis of what is giving meaning and to our lives, and allows us to actually navigate, through the world. So that's what you'll mostly hear, is it's that labeling, recognizing and labeling of objects. Every object that comes in, and you can see that when you, like, it's continuous, right? It's absolutely continuous. It's so ubiquitous. I mean, it goes on constantly that we take it for granted, but you can actually kind of notice it happening. So recognizing and labeling. So after you recognizes and labels it, the next thing is the perception. And I'll discuss these in more detail, but kind of, do I like it, dislike it, or do I, I'm kind of neutral towards it? It's the perception that leads, kind of what my preferences are. So that's kind of the second aspect. And then the third is you kind of perceive the nature of it. Is it permanent, impermanent? Does it bring satisfaction, or is it does it bring dukkha? Is it selfless, or does it have an essence, a self essence to it? So I kind of looked at perception at those three levels: the recognizing, labeling, establishing preferences, and establishing the nature. So I'm going to put up some pictures. I'll have to share the screen here. And I want you to look at the picture and then just kind of notice what arises specifically in terms of perceptions. Can you see that picture? Yeah. So what comes up for people when they see that picture? What kind of perceptions arise? Anyone?
Pleasant.
Before that, is there a perception?
Yes. Oysters.
Oysters, yeah, okay. So that's the first,
Or
it
lemon.
labels it. And then you then following that a preference for it, so pleasant. Anybody else have a different perception of it? Anybody that doesn't like oysters, perhaps?
Not me.
Not me, as in you don't like oysters?
Yeah, I got a very strong yuck.
Yuck, okay. Very strong yuck, okay. So but you had the perception oyster when you saw it?
Food, actually.
Food, okay. It's so yuck that you didn't even want to think the word oyster, perhaps. It's like,
Yeah.
I had one person just saw lemon when they looked at it. When I showed this in the past, they hated oysters so much that they just saw a lemon with a background to it. So yeah, that's just, and so the oysters, or that object, has no pleasantness or unpleasantness to it. It's simply, excuse me, based on your experience with it. And even being able to recognize it as oysters depends on whether you've told, this is what it is. How about that one? Can you see the next one? Yeah. So anybody, what perceptions arise there? Perhaps even emotions.
Aversion.
Aversion. So the perception, snake.
Yeah.
And then it's then a strong negative perception to the point of aversion. Yeah.
I found mine's changed over the years. Used to be aversion. Now I see cute, and that the snake is smelling, and I'm curious and stuff like that. But there used to be a very strong aversion, so it's interesting to see the difference. Yeah.
Yeah. So our preferences change over time. They shift and evolve, and over time. So that's interesting too. So they're never permanent, even in that way. time. So the same for me. I guess I was kind of neutral towards snakes, and then I saw lots of friends. We have like a snake nest right in front of our cottage, right where we swim. So there's always water snakes swimming around, and some of our friends are have quite a reaction to them. Will excuse me, won't go near the water until I've checked to make sure there aren't any there. So I've come to think they like cute. They're nature, and they're fascinating animals. So again, yeah, so it's shifted from neutral for me to curiosity and kind of a real love for their uniqueness. Yeah. Can you see that one? Yeah. So what arises for people when they see that in terms of perceptions?
Bad fashion choices.
Anybody?
I think like the first word that came to mind was fashion, and then I was very, very averse to it.
Okay.
Yeah, I just think it looks a bit ridiculous in my personal opinion.
Yeah. So
Oh.
an opinion even. So yeah, preferences. So label, recognize label, preferences, and then that can even with more thought, opinions will develop, right?
Mhm.
And that's where we get into views and opinions that the Buddha talked about. You can see how that can be all traced back to perception, our views and opinions. Yeah. Anybody else have a different perception and set of perceptions?
I thought it was amusing.
Amusing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. See, I won't tell you mine because my wife. If it wasn't for my wife, I would probably dress in similar ways. So, how about that one? Not a lot of reaction, just perhaps art. Would you paint your house that color? No.
Well, I would say it's, I mean, if you were to take that sort of pleasant, unpleasant, neutral, that would be unpleasant to me.
Unpleasant. Okay.
Yeah.
That quickly takes me to a whole series of thoughts, like thinking of, oh, I think there's houses like that in San Francisco, and I really like San Francisco, and I'd really like to be able to travel again. And so a whole bunch of series of things occur when I look.
Yeah, so papancha can kick in right from our preferences, and that's interesting too. And that'll happen when you're meditating, right? You'll hear a sound, you hear a bird, and then you think, oh, I used to hear these birds at my grandmother's, and then, oh, my grandmother had a really nice house. Oh, I need to look at my career if I'm going to buy a house. I wonder if I'm in the right career. That's papancha kind of in the extreme. But I laugh. But how many people have had that happen during a meditation? It's so that then that's kind of thought proliferation that occurs.
Isn't it sort of an example of like, causes and conditions? I mean, there you have like a whole series of causes and conditions that you bring to that kind of influence how you see that, right?
Yeah, it's all causes and conditions and genetics. Yeah.
Yeah.
And the last one.
Wow.
Oh, okay.
Well, it's Hellraiser, isn't it? Isn't that what that's from? I mean, this is our
Pinhead,
condition. We
yeah.
already know what that is in terms of from a movie.
So your perception went right to what movie it is
Yeah.
because you've been exposed to it. Okay. Other people
And
just
I've never
say,
even
"Ah,
watched it. I've only seen that, like pictures of it.
yeah. And then horror movies might come to mind as a perception, and then whether you like or dislike horror movies could then arise as a perception. Yeah, so that gives you kind of an idea of how perceptions can be varied from person to person, especially from country to country. You'll see very different preferences, labels, and so on from country to country, and over time within ourselves as well. So I'm just going to give you a little more overview of each of those categories, and then we can open it for more questions. So the very important is recognizing and labeling objects. So any objects that appear through the sense doors, this notices the distinctive qualities of that object and labels it. That's the kind of fundamental purpose or operation, I should say, of perception. So you'll see color, shape, form. You'll put, you just looked at some pictures. So, your eyes saw an image, you put form into the image, color, and then put a label on it. So it sounds the same thing. It's just sound is just vibrations, right? Hitting the eardrum. Perception recognizes that sound and then kind of searches through your memory for the appropriate label to put on that sound. So it enables us to make sense of the world, make it manageable, make the world predictable in some ways. And so it has a huge power in how we relate to the world. You can see that how powerful this is, and it's always operating because it's constantly turning sensory experience into something that can be identified, recognized, and then usually, in many cases, acted upon. But it's always the result of contact, right? Sense organ, sense object, sense consciousness. You have sensory experience or contact, and then a perception of that contact. That's important to, we've talked about that many times, those three things coming together, right? Very important for the Buddhist teachings that we understand when we say experience, that's what we're referring to, a sense object, sense organ, sense consciousness. Those three coming together, contact, and then perception. Make sense of that sensory experience that we're having. So, and none of this is under our control, right? In that sense, and I'll talk a little bit more about how we can practice with it and train it. The second level is what perception judges it, things that we prefer and not prefer, like and dislike. There's a perceptive kind of judgment about the objects. And you saw that with oysters. Some people, the perception, oysters, pleasant, some unpleasant, depending on the taste or smell or appearance, that whatever sense door it's coming through, or all three, whether it results in pleasant or unpleasant. So you can get to start to see that we take this personally, right? It kind of starts off as a very impersonal process, right? Just something arising, and then, oh, I like this or I don't like this. So I am one who likes oysters, or I am one who doesn't like oysters. And we start to see it happening to me. This is a me that I'm here and the object is there, and we're separate. I'm a separate self, that's a separate object, and I have this preference or dislike or a like for that object. So you get one, you can see how a self starts to arise, depending on how we relate to these preferences as they arise. And it happens so quickly that most people on the planet, most people don't even recognize that it's happening. They just kind of go along and really are unconscious, you could say, of the whole process, because the process of cognizing and perception happens so quickly. But you can actually see a series of mental steps if you really look closely and notice moment to moment. And you can actually start to see it's not self nature, it's empty nature. Or as the Buddha would called perception mirage. Do you remember that quote? Form is like a lump of foam, feeling like bubbles in the water, perception like a mirage, volitional activities like a centerless banana tree, and consciousness like a magical illusion, or trickery is the word that's often translated. So like a mirage. But we can look and actually see, with observation, we can see the perceptions arising. At the third level, and this is further thought, as Alan kind of pointed out, there's further thought about what's there, and the nature of the object. We start to have some kind of sense of the nature of this object. Do we see it as permanent or impermanent? Satisfying or unsatisfying? Self or selfless? So call those three marks of existence that the Buddha refers to. So again, perception influences view, right? The first of the Eightfold Path is right view, and perception really influences whether we have right view, whether we see things as impermanent, fundamentally impermanent, unsatisfactory, and selfless. Perception feeds into that view that we proliferate, we think about what's being seen. And the Buddha actually referred to unwholesome perception, akusala, wholesome perception, kusala, and neutral perception, yakata. So it's these kinds, he actually spoke about perception in those three ways, which is very similar to how view is spoken about, is right view, in a similar way. So unwholesome perception does not recognize the true sense of the objects that are being received through the sense organs. What is impermanent is seen as permanent, for example. What is suffering is seen as happiness. And what is not self is seen as self. Whereas wholesome perceptions see the true nature of things. They see the impermanence, anicca, dukkha, and anatta. In other words, impermanent, suffering, and not self. So how do we practice? I've said a lot of stuff here. I hope you get those three levels of perception and you can kind of start to see them. I mean, that's, again, the Dharma talk is only as good as as it invites you to go and look into this for yourself. So I invite you to really look at perception arising moment by moment. We can practice with it and see its selfless, impermanent, unsatisfactory nature. So unlike feeling tone or Vedana, we can actually train perception. So I think that's why the Buddha didn't have it as a foundation of mindfulness. It's actually something that we train through practice. We can train to perceive the true nature of objects, to see if we have a misperception, if we misperceive the true nature of what's arising. So we can actually train it. We can kind of change our lens and see its true nature. we can, and whenever we talk about training, there's an opportunity in the pause, and I've spoken about this pause before, between stimulus and response. Remember that Viktor Frankl, I believe, the quote, between, how's it go, between stimulus and response, there's a space, right? And in that space is your power. I think it goes something like that, of power of choice, I think is the word he uses. I came across a research, Benjamin Libet, Libet. It's an interesting study, and I want to read more of these studies. Discovered the part of the brain responsible for movement activates a quarter second before we become aware of our intention to move. Have you heard of this study? Yeah. So, I mean, beyond the whole notion of free will, which is interesting, right? So do you get what I'm saying there? The part of the brain responsible for movement activates. So he's doing functional MRIs. So that part of the brain that activates, it's going to move a quarter of a second before you're aware of your intention to move. So he can see that you're going to move by scanning your brain before you're aware that you're going to move. The computer knows you're going to move before you're aware that you're going to move by scanning your brain. Do you see what I'm getting at there?
Sorry, Stephen,
Yeah.
can I interrupt before I forget?
Yeah.
Is that true even after you train yourself to become aware of your intentions?
I think you'd notice the intention, but it's already after the brain is already activated to move. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So it points to an opportunity, though. We can catch our thoughts and perceptions and act from a wiser place rather than our habitual patterns, right? We can have a kind of a quarter second opportunity there to notice what's arising in our thoughts and perceptions. So really being able to see perceptions in that space between stimulus and response. Yeah. I think perhaps the key message here is realizing how your perceptions kind of create your own universe, your own world, right? That we each have our own kind of mind-created world, and no two of them are the same, and they change over time. And no two of our worlds are actually the same. So there might be some superficial agreement on things, like for most people, stubbing your toe is perceived as unpleasant, right? Hitting your funny bone, that's another one that for most people arises as unpleasant. Perhaps if you're trained in awareness and that's what you're practicing, then you might see it as an opportunity to practice with sensation. So there, doesn't mean it's always unpleasant, but for the most part, there's kind of an agreement, superficial agreement. But for the most part, in truth, we live in a separate world formed through perceptions, and the Buddha would say primarily through misperceptions, that we misperceive the true nature. That we suffer because we misperceive the true nature of reality, of our sense experience, of phenomenon. So as you kind of observe and contemplate your perceptions, you get kind of a profile of the kind of tendencies that you have that cause suffering and stress, agitation, anger, greed, defensiveness, might trigger, start to get a profile of those aspects. They can be seen. And that's where we start to let go of these misperceptions. Yeah, I'll leave it there and open it up for questions, see what's on people's minds around perceptions.
I have this quote that came up on Tri